Thanks for joining. We're so excited to have this first webinar with Brian here. It's a very interesting topic that I'm all here to also learn from Brian. This is one of the most important topics. He's going to tell us about the key performance indicators for brand communities. This is the number one topic whenever we come to any sort of QBR or account review with our customers. Is like, how do we actually show the value of the customer community to the business, to the leadership team? So you're here to learn from Brian today. He's been, I'll let him introduce himself, but, we are so proud to have Brian as a partner with us. He's been a consultant in this industry for a long time, and also have been leading so many communities in the past, but I'll let him also introduce himself. Just a couple of points before I pass the ball to him. Part of this will have the intros, the presentation, and then we'll have time for Q&A, but feel free. We're gonna have we have the chat here as well as an option for you to ask your questions. Brian will address that at the end of the call. We'll also briefly talk about the upcoming events that we will have at Bettermode. Ask questions at any time. Use that, share the ideas, and just for you to know, we'll have the recording of this webinar. We'll share that with you, so you will have access to this. Hopefully, Brian has already provided the deck, so if he allows, we're just going to attach that to the email as well. All right, just a little bit about Bettermode for those who are not familiar. We're a customer community platform, one of the most customizable solutions in the market. We've got a lot of inspiration from powerful website builders and are bringing that power to communities, so the community management team can tailor the experience that they want for their community members. We have a lot of templates that customers can choose from, or they can just start from scratch. We have an open community. Lots of great contents there, including the past webinars that we've had with other thought leaders in this space. So, make sure to just go and check it out. It's on bettermode.com/hub, and we've used our own product to build our own customer community for sure as a community platform. So excited, Brian, again to have you. Well, I'm sure our guests, many of them already know you, but for those that are not super familiar, we'd appreciate if you can provide an intro.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming, everybody. Got lots of good stuff for us today. I'm Brian. I've been helping companies build communities for like 25 years plus, back to the 90s. So, I kind of bring that perspective, and frankly, I've done this so many different ways wrongly that my goal is always to steer people away from, the bad things and focus on the good things. So that's sort of the goal, and, a little bit about me and where we're coming from here.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. I'm just gonna, let's get the party started. I'm just gonna stop sharing. So Brian, you can take over the screen and hopefully go through the presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me know when that is coming through for everybody. There it goes. And I'm going to get the chat up here. So feel free to, ask questions, folks, as we go along. I love these virtual things because I get to present and watch the chat and, sort of respond to people in real time, which can't really do in person. So feel free to ask away as we go along here. So we're going to talk about key performance indicators for brand communities. I'm going to jump right in because frankly, there's a lot here and I want to make sure you get the value. So I'm going to skip past all the Brian slides and let's talk about outcomes. So here, we're going to do three things specifically here today. Number one, I'm going to help you identify the right metrics, the right KPIs, the things you should be measuring to know what the value of your community is. So we'll talk a little bit about the different kinds and how you can, sort of shape that for your own community. I'll talk a little bit about how to interpret data. It turns out that, we can make data say whatever we want, depending on our biases, our perspectives, what we want to happen, what we don't want to happen. So I'll make sure we kind of talk a little bit about how do you interpret data to make sure you know what it's telling you, and then you can make better decisions. And the third piece here is I'm going to talk a little bit about how do you communicate this, right? So it's one thing to have the data, to have the metrics, to understand the KPIs, but how do you communicate that inside your company? How do you communicate that to the stakeholders and other people to help them understand what the value of community is, and then get more buy-in and budget and headcount and all those sorts of things? So those are the outcomes. At the end, we'll do Q&A as well. And I'll show you a link where you can go get the slides. And then I actually have like a little bit of an offer for you at the end too. So stay tuned for that. Before I jump in deep into content here, I'd love to just hear real quickly, if you just want to type it into the chat, what kind of metrics are you tracking today? What kinds of things, are those of you on the webinar here, what are you looking at every day? Or what are you reporting out internally in your company? Marcy says none. We're just getting started. Okay. Jan or Jan, not sure which one it is, says user engagement. All right. So yeah, attendance at events, community member growth, user generated content, active users, ARR impact. I like that, Tom. We're going to talk a little bit about that one. Churn, net new members, courses completed. Awesome. This is all good stuff. Good things to measure. I see more coming in. Okay, great. So this is good. Whether you're measuring anything today or not, this is going to be for you. We're going to talk about it. And, for those of you that haven't done it yet, this will provide a good foundation. For everybody else, this may give you some tips to kind of improve on what you're already doing. So let's talk about, how do you identify, what those metrics and KPIs are. First of all, what I want to say is that when I talk about data and community metrics and KPIs, I often talk about two different buckets or two different types of things that we measure or we should measure, and they're actually not the same. And so philosophically, there's two things. One is this, which is operational metrics. And don't worry, I'm going to show you exactly what these are. But these are basically the like run the business or run the community type metrics, right? And so you need to understand for yourself as the person managing the community, what's happening, what are people doing, what do they like, what do they not like, what's resonating with them, what should we do more of, what should we do less of. Those are the operational metrics. And I'll give you some examples of those in a minute, although some of you have already said them in the chat, which is great. And then the second bucket is the business outcomes. And these are separate things, right? So they're sort of like what's happening in community, how many posts do we have, that sort of thing. But then there's the higher level bit, which is, how is this actually impacting our company, right? And both of these are equally important, and you need to do both of these. But it's also the case that who these get reported to is also different, right? You might keep the operational metrics a little bit more to yourself, whereas the business outcomes are things that you talk about a lot inside the company. So let's sort of give you some examples of these, and we'll talk about which ones are important and that sort of thing. We'll start with the operational metrics. So these are sort of the classic, I would say like web metrics that we all had to use early in community building because we didn't have a choice, and, we didn't have platforms like Bettermode with good analytics. So what we did is we plugged in Google Analytics or Omniture or, some other web package, and we had the traditional web metrics, right? How many people are showing up? How many pages are they visiting? What's the bounce rate? How long do they stay on the site? How many pages do they visit? All of these kinds of things. Now, these are good things. You should measure these. You should look at these. You should understand what's happening. But as I talk about the difference between operational and business, outcomes, right? These are the kinds of things that you probably don't want to go into a meeting with your CEO or, whoever it is and talk about how many page views you had, for example, in the community, right? They probably don't care. They probably want to know what the business outcomes are, where other people, these might actually be more interesting if they're more on sort of the community building tactical side. The second sort of tranche of operational metrics are all the typical things you'd expect. Some of you already said these, right? Like how many new members do we have? How many posts are happening? How many, what are people looking at? What do they like? If you have functionality to mark things as best answer or solution or whatever term you use, we often want to see that, right? So we sort of have the classic web metrics, we have the classic community metrics, and then the third tranche is everything else. And some of you mentioned events and ideas and, how are people consuming different types of content? If we've integrated learning, we might want to know how many lessons are completed or how many certifications have been accomplished. So these are sort of like the operational metrics, which, you should pick out these and look at these and track these over time. Let me give you some recommendations though, because that's a lot, right? There's a lot of things on there. And again, we'll make sure you have these slides so you can look at them. The way that I typically teach people to think about operational metrics at a high level is acquisition, conversion, and engagement. So this is sort of the beginnings of like operational measurement of a community. So in acquisition, I typically recommend that you do use unique visitors because we want to understand how many people are coming here, whether they're members or not. We just want to know how many people are coming. And the reason you use this metric is because it's a perfect analog to what happens in other places in your business, whether it's the .com website or monthly active users in your product. Like you can connect a human to a human in the data, right? Which is really important. And then so what we can do is we can set a goal and we can say, okay, how many people do we want to come to our community every month or quarter or year or whatever it is? Let's say 75,000 was the goal. Maybe that's an annual target or, the first half of the year or something. Now we can actually do the math and say, okay, well, we actually have, many hundreds of thousands of people coming to our .com website every single month, quarter, year, whatever. What percentage of them do we want to, have click through and go to the community? Now, of course, you're probably saying 100%. Of course, we want all of them, right? But I think we know that that's not the case. And so you typically set a target like 10%, 5%, and then we can measure it, right? And we can sort of do the math and say, here's what percentage of our visitors to the website or our customer base or whatever the case is are actually coming to the community. That in and of itself gives us some pretty good intelligence, right? About what's happening here, what's important, how can we make it better, right? We're 2% off of our target. What do we got to do to get more people to come to the community? Once we get them there, the next question is, what do we do with them? Well, we want to convert them, right? We want to convert them into new members. So this is where we use, unique new members, and you see the exact same thing unfolding. We can set a target. We can use, some of those classic 99-1, 30-10-10, like those things to set some of these targets. But I'm now understanding, okay, here's the total pie of people. Here's how many are coming to community. Here's how many of those people are now becoming members, right? So I'm building a flow kind of in a very marketing, style way, I guess, like a funnel. You could look at it that way. And then the same thing for engagement, right? And we could say, maybe in this case, we're going to use posts or total posts, or in this one, I wanted to use first post from new members so that I can keep that flow very clear. And you can see with something like this, now I have a really great amount of intelligence of how people are coming to the community, how they're flowing through, and where the problems are, right? So, for example, if you look at this, I'm not too far off the targets, but what you often find is people say, we have an engagement problem. We don't get as much engagement as we want. And I go look at the data, we build a flow like this, and what you often uncover is that they don't have an engagement problem. What they have is an acquisition problem or a conversion problem, right? And so we can start to see, where is the actual bottleneck? Like, what do we need to do to make this better? So hopefully that kind of gives you a sense. You can do something like this. You can choose different things, but I'm always trying to simplify this for companies and people building communities to build a flow like this, maybe even build a dashboard, that automatically updates. So that you can sort of understand these kinds of things. And then it gives you, now you can make better decisions about what you work on or what you don't, right? So that was those. Let's go talk about business outcomes here. Now there's a bunch of stuff here. I'm going to sort of, kind of gloss over each one a little bit because I don't want to spend all the time. But depending on which group you're in the company, we want to talk about, hey, how is community influencing actual business outcomes, ROI, those sorts of things. So if you're in customer support or you're talking to the customer support team, these are the kinds of things they care about, right? They care about decreasing the overall cost to deliver support. They talk about, how do we make our support agents better at their jobs? How do we get more efficient? Clearly, communities can help with those. And then one other thing they're always interested in is like, how can we use community to understand what problems customers are having and maybe detect big issues faster than we normally would through our kind of typical case workflow and that sort of thing, right? So these are the types of things that we can look at and say, hey, the community can actually help with all three of these things. And then we can make a plan around how are we going to do that? And then how are we going to measure it, right? So very strategic, sort of departmental focused pieces here. Same thing with sales and marketing. What do they care about? They care about leads, right? They want to know, how many people are in the community that aren't already customers. Okay, we can help you with that. They typically want things like increased advocacy, either, from a marketing perspective or sales. Sometimes they want people to come talk to prospects and tell them about, how great their product is. Community can help with that. Better educated customers, right? If we integrate some sort of LMS or learning stuff or knowledge or whatever the case is, obviously there's a story there. Product and development. How do we ship better products? How do we gather feedback? How do we get ideas, right, from our customers? Community can help with those things. And last but certainly not least, our friends in customer success. They're thinking about reducing churn. We saw these numbers here in the chat, right? Like people were talking about measuring churn, ARR, NRR, those kinds of business outcomes. So most of you probably know this, but the question is, how do we take each one of these bullets and actually measure it and then turn that into a story, right? That we can go talk to these groups and say, hey, did you know the community is helping us reduce costs? Or, people that are in the community tend to churn less. Like those types of outcomes are really, really powerful, right? So let's take a look at an example of that. Pretty simplistic here. We'll start with we'll do the support one because that's pretty common. Typically the goal is like, hey, costs are skyrocketing. We have so many more customers than we used to. How are we actually going to scale as a company? Because we can't hire an infinite number of support agents, for example. Okay, great. We're going to build a self-service support community, right? So that's the goal and the strategy. And then how are we going to measure it? Well, typically we measure this through what we would call deflection, right? What's the dollar value of every single solved support query in community? So that's the KPI, but then the real question is, can we actually measure that, right? Do we have the data? Like it's one thing to put on a slide, here's how we're going to measure this thing and know if it's successful or not. Can we access the data? Do we know where it is? Are we asking people the right questions? And so you translate that down to, okay, what are the actual numbers, metrics, data that I need to make that happen? I need the number of visits. I need to survey people coming to community to see if we're actually resolving their problems or not. I need to go to the support team and ask them what their cost per case is so that I can do the math. I have to know how much community costs, right? So maybe I have to partner with finance on that. So there's a cross collaborative effort here, right? It's not just about us as community builders. We have to partner with other people in the business to understand, okay, we need all this data, and then we can take that data and go calculate, what is the deflection of this thing? And then I can go back and tell that story inside of the company, right? So I'm going to move on here to interpretation, but hopefully that was sort of a good overview of the two different types of data and like how you think about them. But what happens when the data starts flowing in? You start getting charts and graphs and numbers, and this sort of stuff can kind of be overwhelming. And one thing I typically see is that sometimes we make the wrong interpretation of the data. So what I want to do is kind of take you through a couple of examples and show you what I mean to help you kind of ask better questions of your data, which is the most important part. So let's start with average time on site. So again, sort of the operational metric here, sort of that classic web metric. Oftentimes I'll show up at a company and I'll say, hey, can I take a look at your Google Analytics or whatever you have? Or maybe you already have charts. Can we look at that and see what it looks like? And this is what the chart will look like. And I'll say, what's going on here? What do you see? And by the way, as I'm doing these in the chat, feel free to sort of type what you think is happening here. And I'll kind of slowly reveal and talk about what I think is happening. But we sort of see this, okay, average time on site in minutes. So along the course of time, it seems like it's going up, right? It seems like maybe people are spending more time on the site. Now, when you show up at a company, oftentimes they're going to say, this is great, right? People are spending more time on the site. They're excited. We're accomplishing our goal. Our engagement programs are working. This is wonderful, right? Mission accomplished. Maybe, it might be. It also might not be, right? It depends a lot on what are your goals? What are you trying to do with the community? Right. So like some people may look at this and say, hey, this is great. People are spending more time on the community. But if you're a support community, for example, or a success community, or you're more about enablement and knowledge, this could be bad, right? We could look at this and say, well, actually, maybe this means the community is getting less efficient over time. Maybe it means that people are having a hard time finding what they're looking for, or the content isn't as clear as it used to be, or that our navigation isn't what it should be. Now, without seeing the community, right, it's really hard to suss all of that out. This is so much context required, but these are the kinds of questions I want you to ask, right? As you see charts and graphs, don't just look at it and say, oh, this is great. Time on site's going up. We're doing a wonderful thing. This might actually be the worst outcome possible. Or it could be the best, right? If you're a marketing or an affinity community, a brand community, right? This could be great news for you. So it really depends on what your goals are, what you're trying to do. But ask those types of questions and don't just take it on face value, right? So let's look at another one, another web metric here, average pages per visit. What about this one? What do you all think is happening here? Type that in the chat, right? So over the course of time, it seems like the average pages per visit. So every time someone comes, maybe it's, maybe it was 5 initially, now it's 3, maybe it's 2. We don't have an axes label here. Jan or Jan says finding their answers quicker. Totally. Could be, right? Maybe we're getting better at this. Maybe we're actually helping people find what they want faster, so they have to go to less pages. Maybe we've recently streamlined our navigation. Maybe search got better. Maybe discovery got better, right? On the other hand, right, it could be the exact opposite, right? It could be, this is bad. People are spending less time. They're going to less pages. They're not consuming as much as they used to. Context is everything, and your goals and outcomes are everything, right? Which is what we're driving home here. So I can't really tell you what the answer to this is without all of that context, but these are the types of questions you should be asking as you're looking at these. Okay, let's go on to a little bit of a, maybe I wouldn't say harder, but more nuanced one, even more nuanced than what we looked at before. So this is solution rate across a number of years. And the percentage there on the y-axis, what we're basically saying is what percentage of questions in a community have an answer that has been marked as the solution or best answer or whatever term, right, that your platform uses. And we have 2 things here. We have community A, which has been fairly level, fairly steady for some period of time, right? And then we have community B, which was also fairly level and steady for a number of years. But sometime in the middle or kind of early 2019, it looks like that number went way up, right? Which community is better? Which one do you want? So this is another great example of like, what questions would we ask to sort of interpret this data? Starting with community A, we might say, it's interesting that it's been very level, very consistent for a very long period of time, right? So that could mean that they're a very mature community. Most of this kind of common knowledge is already handled, right? And we're still generating content and knowledge along the way, but it's maybe not as new and fresh as community B could be. It could be that they just really haven't invested too much or haven't incentivized users to mark things as solutions. And so it continues on sort of unabated right into the future. Interesting, different things there. Looking at the chat here. Hey, Tiff's here. Tiffany Oda. Internal cleanup could have happened for community B. Could be one thing. Launch new product, new feature, M&A, says Joel. Yeah, so there's a couple of things going here for Blue potentially. One is perhaps they have made a concerted effort to get their customers to mark more solutions, either by doing campaigns, by changing the UI UX in the community, or, and this is what typically the answer is, not always, but typically the answer is when you see something like this, is that they're artificially inflating their solutions. So oftentimes I show up at companies and I say, hey, tell me about your metrics, show me your solution rate, how's that going? And you'll often also, excuse me, on LinkedIn sometimes see people quote these numbers. We have 99% solution rate in our community. When you see that, almost always, 9 times out of 10, what the reality is, the difference between community A and community B here is that community A, these are organic solutions, right? These are just customers or members coming in and marking solutions on their own without too much kind of intervention. And that's why it's pretty steady. When you see a big uptick, or you see somebody say, oh, our community has a 99, 98, 89% solution rate, it's typically because the company themselves are going in and marking things as solutions. Now, we can argue about the merits of that. I think it depends how you do it. It depends, are these actually the right answers? Or are we just inflating the numbers? But typically anything above like 30%, 30 or 40% solution rate usually means that there's some sort of manipulation happening by the company. And again, that may be good or bad, right? So really good questions to ask. Don't take it as face value, and kind of understand like what happened in 2019, because we didn't just wake up one day and our solution rate doubled or tripled or whatever, right? It's not going to happen. Okay, so last but not least here, sort of on the business side of it, right? What about deflections? So here's our chart from 2016 to 2021. These are the number of deflections that we've calculated using that data and the surveys and all the stuff that we looked at before. What's happening here, right? They're sort of scaling. So like, okay, great, we're doing more deflections. That could mean we just have more customers. It could mean we're doing better at content over the years and, having better questions and answers and solve things and knowledge and learning for people. But what do we notice sort of in the middle of 2019, 2020? Kind of this leveling off, right? Now, some people would look at this and say, and again, in the chat, maybe put some of your assumptions of why this could happen. Some people would see a chart like this and panic, right? They'd be like, oh no, it's leveling off. I don't get to like tell the story anymore about like this infinite growth story that we're doing all the time. What are we going to do? Now, it could mean a few things, right? On the plus side, it could mean, hey, we're a mature community. People are getting better and smarter, and we've accomplished our goal at making people understand the product better, and maybe they don't need to come here as much, right? That maybe we've launched a new enablement program or an onboarding program for the products and services we have, and that's leveling the playing field here. They need less deflections because they're better educated up front, right? There's a lot of reasons why this actually could be a good thing and an okay thing. And actually, most communities get to this point anyway, if you're mature enough. On the other hand, could be very bad, right? It could be, hey, the community's not working like it used to. Maybe we're not generating the content that we used to. Maybe we've kind of taken our foot off the accelerator a little bit, and we need to work on this a little bit more. Maybe it means we aren't growing the company at the same rate, right? This might actually be indicative of nothing to do with the community, and it might have everything to do with the growth of our company and the growth of our customer base. There just simply isn't as many of them scaling like there was before. And so we see that reflected in our deflections, right? And usage of community. So there's a lot of different things happening, and you're starting to get the gist of where I'm going here with understanding the context, interpreting the data. Don't make an assumption that it's always the greatest thing in the world or the worst thing in the world. It's probably somewhere in the middle, and understand it before you do what we're about to talk about, which is go talk inside your organization about it, just because I don't want you to go tell stories that aren't true or get yourself into trouble if people start asking the kinds of questions in a meeting or something that I'm asking here. Okay, so that's the interpretation bit. Let's move on, and I'm keeping track of time here a little bit. Let's move on to storytelling, which I think is actually the most important part of all of this. I think, of course, they're all important. I want you to pick the right metrics and interpret them. But at the end of the day, if you can't actually articulate, here's what's happening, here's why it's important, here's why you care, stakeholder or, whoever it is inside the company, then none of the first two things actually matter. So you have to bring it all home, sort of with the storytelling bit here. So let's kind of talk about what some of these look like. These are real one-liners that I've used inside a company. So I've never tell you to say or do anything that I myself have not done. These are absolutely real. The numbers have been changed, but the story's true. Okay. So 40% of new business revenue came from customer accounts with communities with community users prior to closing the deal. So what does that mean? It means that we have opened our community to prospects. We are pointing them to it during the sales cycle, and they are getting some sort of value. They're signing up for an account. They're taking some of our academy lessons. They're looking at knowledge. They're asking questions to sort of suss out, does this product do what it says it does? Can I use it for my use case? And then we were able to prove on the back end with this data, both the operational and the business outcome data, right? That 40% of net new customers essentially have used community prior to closing a deal. Really interesting data point. And when you go talk to sales about that, all of a sudden, it's like, oh, interesting, this community thing, there's something to this, right? What about customer support? If we do the metrics and the numbers we looked at before, we can say, hey, 80% of our total customer support volume takes place in community, right? Good luck turning community off or laying off the community team when you see a number like that, right? It really makes community indispensable. 85% of account expansion revenue, so basically upsells, renewals, revenues, et cetera, come from accounts with active and engaged community users. Or as I used to say inside of companies, if you're not getting your customers in the community, you're lighting money on fire. We can prove that with data points like this. Net revenue retention, right? Comes from customer accounts with community users is 125 versus 90%. And what's really interesting about that one is 90% is less than 100, which means basically the customer accounts that have no community users, you are lighting money on fire, right? You have 90%, whereas 125, we're not only keeping the ones we have, we're upselling them to even more revenue, right? So you can see how these kinds of things, hey, we generated this much money, you get down to the dollar value, that's an even better thing to do. You can see how all of these, would be really compelling internally. You have to do the data work first to get here, obviously. You can't just make up a number and throw it out there. But if you're able to get to this place and articulate it in this way to people that care about these things, support, success, revenue, whoever it is, you're going to kind of level up your entire community game and everything that you're doing inside of your company. And people then you'll have their attention for sure. Okay, so those are some one-liners. But let's talk about how you make it visual, right? So it's one thing to say this stuff in a meeting or, that sort of thing. But what about kind of visually, right? So I tend to use stuff like this as a very, kind of overall context setting for people of why are we doing this community thing? Why does it matter, right? Now, does your business really look like this? Is it always this clean and perfect? Of course not. But conceptually, this is what we're trying to do, right? We're scaling as a business. We know that we can't keep up with it at the same rate that we always have. So one of the things we're going to do is we're going to launch this community. We're going to scale the community content, which is in green here, right? And then as we do that, the goal is with community content scaling and the overall sort of usage of community scaling, hopefully for things like onboarding and learning and knowledge and support, the goal is that the total number of touches we need to do as a company as it relates to this kind of, how-to support stuff levels off. It doesn't mean that it's going to go away or it's going to go to zero or, we need to lay off the support team. It's none of those things. It's just saying we're getting more efficient, right? We're getting better at what we do, which you see here in blue with effort required. This is what success looks like at most companies in the world when it comes to matters of support and matters of success and, sort of servicing customers, right? Show something like that inside your company to help them understand why we're doing this. And then you can use the real data to actually show this as well. A few more examples. These are real slides that I've used in the past. Of course, I've changed some of the names and numbers and whatnot, but these are real. These are the kinds of things I put together inside of companies to help people understand what's happening, right? So in this particular case, this one's obviously support case deflections and actually overall support case volume. And so we could show, hey, look at how it was scaling over time, just this kind of linear up and to the right, for these are by quarters, by the way. So quarter, up and to the right, forever and always. Can't do that forever, right? We're going to get crushed under the weight of our own success. We can see where we launched the community. It's not like it solved this problem overnight. We still had a year or more, as you can see, 4 quarters there, right? All the while we're launching new products. And so that's making it harder because we have to support new versions and educate people about new versions. So pretty linear. But then something crazy happens right around the middle of that graph, right? All of a sudden, we stemmed the tide. And the other thing is, if I overlaid this with the customer growth at that time, customer growth continued to just exponentially scale over time. So this was very, very impressive to say, hey, look, we did it, right? Community is working. We have leveled off kind of the growth in support cases, even as we launch new products and even as we grow pretty significantly quarter over quarter, year over year as a company. So when you start showing a chart like this around the company, all of a sudden, people sort of visually, for people that are more visual, kind of understand this, right? And then the context that's there on the slide. Here's the same thing, but by queries by channel. So other people want to see it this way. This is particularly effective for our friends in support and other executives in the company, where you basically just say, hey, based on the number of deflections that we've calculated, here's what we think the total support that we're delivering through community is versus the traditional channels that we have, which is a number you have to, of course, get from support. And we can see over time that we actually accomplished that, right? And that we went from 70-30 essentially to inverse 60-40 over the course of, in this case, a year. Again, real chart, different numbers. This is a real chart. So you can imagine, flashing this around and telling the story and showing people in this way visually. It's like, okay, cool. Yeah, let's do more of this community thing. Here's one for success, right? That we built to show, hey, here's what community's doing inside of customer success. It turns out that people that are engaged in community plus 12 on their health score, right? They expand at a rate, 89% faster than other people. And we retain them, as I said before, kind of earlier on the one-liners, we not only retain them, but they buy more, which is how you get 121% of a retain number. So these kinds of, taking the data, making it visual, putting it into kind of a storytelling format in a way like this that they'll resonate with, obviously super, super powerful, super important. And then ultimately just helps you build even more community over time. Okay, so I said a lot, almost right on time, just a little bit behind there. You can go get these slides at brianoblinger.com/slides, as well as everything else that I've done. So if you want to dive deeper into this data and metrics and analytics stuff, there's another set of slides on that page that actually dives even deeper into this. It's a masterclass. So you can go find those or this one or anything else. With that said, happy to answer any questions that we can.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. This was super insightful. So feel free to post your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. But something that, Brian, I always hear from our clients, especially community manager, is that, like, what is the right frequency of telling that story to the leadership team? Like, how frequent that touch point should happen in order to show the value?
I love this question. This is one of my favorite questions to answer around this stuff. So what a lot of people do is they report it way too frequently, right? And I understand why. A lot of companies have these cadences of, hey, every week at the end of the week, we want, a report from you about what you did this week. And so they think, okay, I'll just put my community numbers in there every single week, right? Or I'll send out this report every single week. And I understand why people do it. Sometimes it's pressure, sometimes it's, company mandates or whatever. What I've come to find is that reporting it too frequently, due to the nature of just how communities work and community data, you get what I affectionately call the weekly freakout, which is the numbers go way up one week and all your executives or whoever you're reporting this stuff to are like, this is amazing. We need to shout this from the rooftops. It's like so incredible. Community's amazing. Let's do more of it. What happens next week, right? It goes way down. And now you have the weekly freak out of, oh, this is horrible. What are we doing? We need to fire somebody, whatever. So what I typically advise people is I think monthly and quarterly are probably the two best cadences. And you can pick whichever one's right for you, depending on the situation. I just think you never want to go more granular than monthly, just because we all know the fluctuations and those sorts of things. And it may be that for different audiences, some people get it monthly, and then maybe executives get it quarterly, right? And that way you sort of strategically share the data and the trends and those sorts of things, while also protecting yourself from triggering these freakouts that happen when we look at data on too granular of a level.
Awesome. Thank you for that. While we're waiting for other questions to come in, something that I've also experienced with many of the communities, because like at the end, the platforms, all the community platforms that host these interactions between the customers have limited visibility into what is happening in the bigger business, right?
Yep.
Like you talked about net dollar retention, for instance, like how it's impacting that. And sometimes in companies, like there are not really established data teams that you can just like easily connect the dots. How do you think community managers should navigate such situations where the community platform has limited visibility into what is happening actually in the business, and there isn't a great data team, but are there like workarounds to still be able to show the value?
Yeah, as much as it pains me to say, it's true that community platforms are a data source, just like any other data source, right? I wish I wish they could do everything and measure everything and give me the beautiful dashboard and all that stuff. It's just not going to happen, right? And for good reason. It's not a slight on platforms, right? It's just the reality of the world. And so what I tell people about this is, you're absolutely right. You can measure a lot of those operational metrics we talked about earlier through community. So, that's great. But when it comes to the red business metrics, that were business outcomes we talked about, you're right that those, you have to just use community as a data source and mix it with other data sources. So Salesforce, for example, other places. But that's easier said than done. As you've pointed out, don't always have the access to those systems. And so what's required is collaboration, right? You have to go make partnerships with those other teams internally and say, hey, how can we get this community data somewhere that we can mix it with your data, or can I get access to that? Or maybe you work at a company that has a centralized data team or data science team or something. But getting access to them is also not the easiest thing in the world. And so typically what I recommend for people is, if possible, go find someone in the company who cares about this stuff, start to show them, particularly at an executive level, right? And have them drive it from the top down to say, this is important. I need to know the answer to these questions. I'm going to allocate time from our data folks, or at least people that are data curious, if that's all you have. And start to build up that way. But it is challenging, right? It's easy, like I said, to put it on a slide, but you have to do a lot of work, and you have to have a lot of partnerships internally to get access to the data, have someone do the work, and then build the charts and dashboards and all that stuff around it.
Great. Thank you. I have my final questions, and if we don't have anything from the crowd here, I'll just like quickly share my slide to tell about the upcoming event. We've seen the rise of some solutions in the market, that solutions like Common Room, like Orbit, that they are focused on the analytics side of things and helping community managers measure their impact. At what point do you think communities should be looking at those solutions and adopt such solutions in their journey?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm really happy that, Talkbase and all these companies are coming out with functionality like this, because it's been super needed for a long time. And hopefully it's simplifying, some of the technology stack that people used to have to cobble together. Now you can just go and plug in these things with pre-built integrations or data feeds, and you get some insights. As far as when, I think that totally depends on your goals, right? I could see some communities where it might not actually be useful for them to do that until they've, launched a community and they're several months in, and, they have some data. On the other hand, I can also see plenty of arguments to say, you probably want this turned on day one, so that you have as complete a picture as possible of your community. So I think the eye is kind of the beholder there a little bit, maybe of when you do it. But I think the net of it is you should do it. I think those are very valuable platforms. You should plug into them, get some of these insights. And I think the other thing that's really important about them too, not that this is an ad, for any of them, is the automation that comes with them as well. Having the data is good. The question is, what do you do with the data? And one of the things those platforms do really well is not only help you measure it and visualize it and all that stuff, they also help you do automation triggers based on what are we seeing in the data? What does that mean we need to do in the community? So there's a lot of value in these tools. We certainly didn't have these, even 4 or 5 years ago, or let alone, in the 90s or the early 2000s. So yeah, I think it's great that whole class of product exists, and everybody should probably be looking into them and taking advantage.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brian. So we didn't get any other questions in the webinar chat. If you don't mind, I'm just going to share my screen so we can start wrapping. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, real quick. I just want to make sure. I promised people at the beginning, I want to make sure. So, again, not too much of an ad here, folks, but I launched this academy a couple months ago. Wanted to make sure you got some value out of it. So if you go there and you use this code metrics, you can get 15% off a course or a membership or whatever the case is. Just want to make sure I'm giving you some value back. And that's at communitystrategyacademy.com. So anyway, sorry about that, Mo. I just want to make sure we gave them that opportunity.
No, thank you. Thank you for the perk. So we'll make sure to include that in the wrap-up email that we sent. So you guys have that also in the email, so you can use that discount. Just a quick one. Our next event is going to be November 1st with Jenny. She's the founder of Jenny Community. She's been in the consulting space for many years. She's going to talk about crafting exceptional community experience. So, mark your calendars. We'll have emails sent out to remind you of this, so you can sign up if you're interested. And with that being said, thank you all so much, Brian. This was lovely. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with our community, and hopefully we'll see you more 2024.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Mo, for having me, and thanks to Bettermode, and thanks everybody for joining. I always appreciate people showing up and listening, and hopefully you got a bunch of value out of it.
Absolutely. Thank you all. Take care.
Okay.
Have a good one. Bye.
Take care, everybody.